The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the highway engulfed in darkness. The dashboard of my car glowed dimly, the fuel gauge hovering precariously close to empty. I cursed under my breath, regretting not stopping at the last gas station. I was driving through a desolate stretch of road, miles away from civilization. The landscape stretched out before me, an endless expanse of barren fields and looming shadows. It was the kind of place where nightmares were born, where the silence was so thick you could almost hear it pressing against your ears. As the miles ticked by, the needle on the fuel gauge inched closer and closer to empty. Panic gnawed at my insides, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched desperately for any sign of a gas station. But the highway remained empty, devoid of life or salvation. And then, just as the last glimmer of hope began to fade, I saw it. A flickering light in the distance, like a beacon in the darkness. Relief flooded through me as I pulled off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road leading towards the light. The glow grew brighter with each passing moment, promising fuel and respite from the desolation of the highway. But as I rounded the final bend, my heart sank like a stone in my chest. The source of the light was not a gas station, but an old abandoned house, its windows shattered and its walls covered in creeping vines. A chill ran down my spine as I realized my mistake. But with my fuel running dangerously low, I had no choice but to investigate. I parked my car outside the house and stepped out into the night, the darkness closing in around me like a shroud. The air was heavy with the scent of decay as I approached the house, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee into the safety of the night, but something compelled me forward, deeper into the heart of darkness. The interior of the house was as eerie as the exterior, with cobwebs clinging to the walls and dust thick upon the floor. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows, their gaze like icy fingers tracing down my spine. And then, just as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it. A faint whisper drifting through the darkness, so soft it was almost imperceptible. My blood ran cold as I strained to make out the words, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Out of gas," the whisper said, over and over again, each repetition sending shivers down my spine. It was like a mantra, a warning from beyond the grave, and I knew then that I was not alone in the house. With trembling hands, I reached for the door at the end of the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the room beyond. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my days, rows upon rows of gas canisters, their labels faded with age. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted mockery of salvation in the heart of darkness. And then, as I stood there frozen in terror, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the house, growing louder and louder with each passing moment. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I raced back towards the safety of my car. The darkness seemed to stretch out before me, a bottomless pit swallowing me whole as I ran. But just as I reached the door, I felt something grab hold of my ankle, pulling me back into the darkness. I screamed, the sound echoing through the house as I fought against the unseen force dragging me down. And then, with one final desperate lunge, I broke free, tumbling out into the night air with a gasp of relief. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled into the darkness, leaving the abandoned house and its sinister secrets far behind me. I never looked back, never stopped running until I reached the safety of civilization. But even now, as I sit here recounting the events of that fateful night, I can still hear the whisper echoing in the recesses of my mind, a reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of our reality, waiting to drag us down into the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the desolate stretch of highway. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly as she glanced at the fuel gauge, the needle teetering dangerously close to empty. She cursed under her breath, regretting not stopping at the last gas station she had passed. Now, miles away from civilization, the only company she had was the endless expanse of darkness enveloping the road ahead. Emily had always been cautious, but tonight she had been careless. A sense of unease settled in her stomach as she realized the gravity of her situation. She glanced at her phone, hoping for a signal, but it displayed the dreaded "no service" message. Panic began to bubble within her as she scanned the barren landscape for any signs of life. With each passing mile, the silence became suffocating. The only sound was the faint hum of her engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Emily's heart raced as she imagined all the worst-case scenarios. What if someone was lurking in the darkness, waiting to pounce? What if her car broke down completely, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere? As if on cue, the engine sputtered and died, plunging Emily into darkness. She cursed again, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone to use its dim light to assess the damage. But before she could even unlock it, she heard a noise coming from outside the car. It was a soft, shuffling sound, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. Then, without warning, there was a tap on her window. She nearly jumped out of her skin, her eyes wide with terror as she turned to face the source of the sound. Outside stood a figure cloaked in shadow, their features obscured by the darkness. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it a passerby offering help, or something far more sinister? Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Emily rolled down the window just a crack, keeping her eyes trained on the mysterious figure. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond immediately, instead tilting its head to the side as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sent chills down her spine, it spoke. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to find her voice. Yes," she stammered. "My car ran out of gas, and I'm stranded out here." The figure seemed to ponder her words for a moment before finally speaking again. "I can help you," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But everything comes at a price." Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had heard enough horror stories to know that deals made in the dead of night rarely ended well. But with no other options, she nodded hesitantly, her stomach churning with dread. "Very well," the figure said, a sinister grin spreading across its face. "But first, you must come with me." With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Emily stepped out of the car and followed the figure into the darkness. They walked for what felt like hours, the only sound their footsteps echoing against the empty road. Finally, they arrived at a dilapidated gas station, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the deserted pumps. Emily's heart sank as she realized the true nature of her situation. There was no help to be found here, only darkness and despair. As if reading her thoughts, the figure turned to her with a wicked smile. "Here we are," it said, gesturing towards the station. "But remember, everything comes at a price." With a sense of foreboding, Emily approached the nearest pump and began to fill her tank. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around her seemed to shift and twist in the darkness. Just as she was about to finish, a voice echoed in her mind, sending shivers down her spine. "Leave," it whispered. "Leave now, while you still can." Ignoring the voice, Emily hurried to finish filling her tank, desperate to escape this nightmare. But as she replaced the nozzle and turned to leave, she was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. Standing before her was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen, its form twisted and contorted into a grotesque mockery of a human. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light as it reached out towards her, its claws extended and ready to strike. With a scream of terror, Emily turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she fled into the night. Behind her, she could hear the creature's unearthly howls echoing in the darkness, urging her to return and pay the price for her folly. But Emily didn't look back. She ran faster and faster, driven by fear and desperation, until she could run no more. And though she eventually found help and made it safely home,